Did you know there is a color only bees can see? A friend of mine told me it's called the bee purple. It's a combination of yellow and ultraviolet lights, and it attracts bees to flowers. Do you ever wonder how species different from ours perceive the world? The things they see that we cannot see, the speed at which they can react, the routes they follow, and the sweet honey they gather. And how they are born and then die, living their life to the fullest for the brief duration that they are given. Dodonpachi Daioujou is my favorite bullet hell game and my favorite shmup in general. Very soon after this video comes out, M2 will release a port of the game for PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch. It'll be the first time the game is commercially available on a home console since the Xbox 360 version in 2009. In this video, I want to give my take on what makes Daioujou so good. When I say Daioujou is good, I don't mean that it was good for its time or that it's good for fans of retro shooting games. I mean it's good in the sense that it's still worth playing in a world where we have Elden Rings and Starfields. Now sure, there are some things that are a little dated about it, but the point still stands. Daioujou is a classic that defies time. It represents the peak of a certain style of game, namely arcade danmaku. It's the shmup equivalent of something like The Seven Samurai or Tokyo Story, something that the majority of enthusiasts agrees is a masterpiece, even if it's not everyone's personal favorite. But just like with older movies, it can take some time to get the appeal of it and appreciate the beauty of what was accomplished. It's only natural that when you have a piece of art that was created in a certain time and place for a certain audience, that to new players it can at first seem baffling or boring, even hostile. It took me a while to get into Daioujou and understand what makes it stand out. And in this video, I want to share my love for the game with you. So let's go through the basics. Dodonpachi Daioujou was developed by Cave and released by AMI in April of 2002. The name means Angry Leader Bee, Blissful Death. Later that same year, Cave made a slightly tweaked version called Dodonpachi Daioujou Black Label. The original has been retroactively called the White Label to help differentiate between the two. Daioujou was Cave's 7th shmup and the 4th game in the series after Dodonpachi in 1995, Dodonpachi in 1997, and the non-Cave developed Dodonpachi 2 B-Storm in 2001. It has all the staples of the series. You control a ship that has some form of rapid shot, a concentrated laser shot, and a bomb. To clear the game, you need to complete 5 stages of increasing difficulty. And if you manage to clear them while fulfilling certain conditions, like scoring high enough or not dying, you get to continue to the second loop, where you play through harder versions of the same stages. The second loop culminates with the true final boss, Hibachi, who is unlike any other shmup opponent you will face. To score, you need to chain, which means destroying enemies in a quick succession. Counterintuitively, this often means not killing enemies as fast as you can, but actually delaying and choosing your shots carefully so that the screen is never fully empty of enemies. In the upper left you can see your chain meter. When it goes all the way down, your chain breaks and you have to rebuild it from scratch. Daioujou adds something called hypers into the mix. These are power-ups that when activated increase both your and the enemy's firepower considerably. Hypers are the key to getting huge chains, and they can also be used to clear the screen of bullets for a brief moment, but you also have to be ready to dodge even bigger clouds of bullets, or cancel the hyper by bombing. Hypering also raises the basic rank or dynamic difficulty of the game, meaning that the more hypers you use, the more difficult the game becomes. If this is your first time hearing all of this, don't worry, we'll get back to all of this in detail. The main point here is that Daioujou is built on a solid foundation. By 2002, Cave had been making bullet hell shmups for a while. They knew how to make the controls feel good, to have gameplay systems that work together, all that good stuff. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that at this point Cave were already masters of their craft. With Daioujou, they didn't need to reinvent what Danmaku means. They just needed to make a bullet hell game that has excellent design, depth and vibe, without any major flaws. And that's exactly what they did. Daioujou has pretty simple game mechanics. All the core and the soul of the game is basically in how the enemies are placed in the levels and what kind of bullet patterns they shoot. There isn't even a huge variety of enemies, it's more like they're mixed and matched in interesting ways. And this may have been a lucky accident caused by the circumstances that the game was created in. Daioujou was developed in a very short amount of time and under great pressure. I'm guessing that's why they reused some stuff from the original Dodonpachi, like the stage 1 background and some of the stage bosses reappearing in stage 5 of Daioujou. This is just speculation, but I feel like the strict deadline may have forced the team to be creative with the small amount of assets that they had. There's something awe-inspiring in how they managed to make 5 cool levels out of pretty basic components. All the enemies are placed just so to create new challenges, and the patterns swirl together in just the right ways to make it seem impossible, while always being fair. You have the opening level that introduces the interplay of popcorn waves and bigger enemies in different configurations. You need to learn how to dodge and control multiple patterns at the same time. The second level continues this while putting more bullets on the screen, and ending with the iconic hyper corridor with all the buildings and enemies on the sides that you can use to get your first big chain. Stage 3 is the traditional cave beginner wall. Here you really need to figure out your routes and then follow it, or else the screen will just become this chaotic shower of crisscrossing bullet streams. Stage 4 is the enemy rush stage, where you have lots of horizontally moving enemies that try to trap you into a corner. The rail section is interesting because it's one of the few instances of RNG in the game, as the turrets appear at different points every time you play. To me, this adds just the right amount of danger and pressure to the run. And then you have stage 5, which is this long endurance run where the game just tries to throw everything it has at you, with the highlight being the very busy beehive section. You'll know it when you get to it. All of the stages are of a piece, yet different in feel. There's no gimmicks, just pure design. I especially appreciate how the game is paced. Daioujou has this real steady challenge curve where it's not too easy at the start nor too hard at the end, while still escalating from stage to stage. Some of the later cave titles like Dodonpachi Resurrection sometimes feel like you're playing a game of two separate halves. While the early parts are very breezy, but then the final level suddenly ramps up the difficulty and just goes on forever. There's also no cheap tricks of any kind. Like, I've been playing some Mushihime-sama original lately, and it's not too difficult in general, but it's just really hard not to get clipped by a random fast bullet at some point. Now make no mistake, you will die in Daioujou, but it usually won't come as a surprise. The game is harsh, but not unfair, and this goes both ways, as there's no way to cheese the game. You need to learn it to clear it. A big part of the learning process are of course the boss enemies. Here I feel like you get a lot of the same balanced design as in the stages. Like, the bosses are tough but not ridiculous. Their bullet patterns are interesting without being gimmicky. They can be learned, but there's enough small variations in how the patterns behave that you're often forced to play dynamically. They're just very well made, replayable shmup boss fights. I like how serious even the stage 2 boss gets with its crisscrossing needles and the huge bullet rain at the end. Everybody loves the stage 3 turtle that can end your run with this pattern, or especially this pattern. The stage 4 boss has the spiraling gears that turn the whole screen into a 360-degree danger zone. There's just a lot of stuff to get into, and if the bosses start feeling too easy, you can always hyper to really make them angry, but also to give you a bigger score bonus. Now, I'm only talking about the stages and bosses of the first loop here, because I'm not really a 2-loop player. I have tried the second loop in Daioujou, and it seems very difficult. Especially White Label is kinda ridiculous in how it takes all of your lives away and then forces you to earn them back by either no bombing or no missing stages. You can't even continue in the loop in White Label, which doesn't really matter now that we have save states, but was absolutely mean to the original arcade players. I have no conception whatsoever of how people 2-ult this game in the arcades, especially with Hibachi at the end. And so because I'm mainly familiar with the second loop through replays, I won't be commenting on it here. It does seem like a continuation and an acceleration of the challenge in the first loop, and lots of top players enjoy playing it, so check it out if it's your thing. But luckily, there's plenty of reasons to keep on playing the first loop too. On the shmup Reddit, there was recently a thread on whether scoring systems are important or not, and there were people who said, no, they don't care about scoring. And for a long time, I didn't care about scoring, and in some ways, I still don't. When I'm clearing a game for the first time, I tend to concentrate on survival, and then when I clear it, I'm usually ready to move on to something new. So I'm not super interested in trying to get a high score, but I've come to realize that a game having a deep scoring system is a huge part of what makes me enjoy it in the long term. And that's because a good scoring system makes me engage in the game in a different way than just by destroying everything. It rewards me for being creative and taking risks. This is like having a difficulty slider inside the game. As you get better at pure survival, you can start to change your route to be more about scoring. And this means that there's always something to do, something to strive for, something that makes you want to play the game again. As with level design, here Daioujou built something really cool and satisfying out of very few building blocks. So you want to get that hit count as high as possible without breaking your chain. This means that you have to puzzle out where you want to be and what you want to be doing at every moment of the game. You want to be targeting some enemies as soon as they appear on the screen, while leaving others untouched so that you can create links between different parts of the chain. You also need to learn the positions of the hidden bees that appear when you shoot at them with the tip of your laser. These are important because you get both points and hypermeter from them. You can also get hypermeter from point blanking. You can choose to use your hyper as soon as you get it, or you can collect up to 5 of them to make the game go into absolute overdrive. It's much easier to chain while hypering, and your hit count climbs up much faster, but the game also becomes a lot more difficult. So limiting hyper use can also be part of your strategy. All of the time that you are playing Daioujou, you are making meaningful decisions. Should I hyper or should I save it for later? Do I try to extend my chain or go for a safer route? And of course, at the same time as you're juggling these choices, you're also trying to dodge pretty vicious bullet patterns, so you have a constant pull between risk and reward. In games that don't have deep scoring systems like Mahou Daisaksen, the early levels can quickly become kind of a chore where you're always doing the exactly same thing before getting to the more interesting parts of the game. This doesn't mean Mahou Daisaksen is a bad game, I quite enjoy it, but it does become monotonous after a while, and then you feel like you're finished with it for good. With Daioujou, I'm never finished. There are parts like the train section of stage 4 where I have a very solid survival route, but I don't know how to chain it at all, so that's something to work on in the future. There are parts like the whole first half of stage 3 where I know what I want to do, but it's still exciting to see if I can keep the chain going up to the mid-boss. There's parts like this section of stage 1 which I can chain just about every time, but it's still super satisfying to be in place to hit all of these blue ships. And then there's the challenging links between different phases of stages where you really need to have your puzzle pieces lined up if you want to full chain a stage. It's interesting to compare Daioujou with what came before and after in the series. The original Dodonpachi doesn't have hyper, so it's a simpler game where you just try to chain perfectly and never bomb or die. Resurrection is the opposite of that because you have to go through several steps to maximize your score. Like you build up your hyper as fast as you can, then you use that hyper to cancel hundreds of bullets to build up your hit counter quickly, then you build up your hypermeter again, but this time you don't activate it because that way you get a big multiplier on your chain, and then you keep it for the rest of the stage for a ginormous payout. Both games have a very different feel, and I can see how they attract different groups of players. For me, Daioujou is the sweet spot between the original DDP, which is just a little too strict and static, and Resurrection, where the whole thing is just a bit too elaborate. And all the bullet cancelling just feels wrong to me personally. Daioujou is simple to understand, like just keep your chain going, but the hypers allow a lot of freedom in how you approach this, and there's always some room for experimentation and improvement. It's not as open-ended as something like Battle Garega, and I would prefer it to be less punishing. Like if you make a tiny mistake mid-stage and break your chain, that's basically goodbye for your score, and that kinda sucks. But still, it's something that can keep you engaged for a very long time. And it serves both super players who are going for world records and people like me who mostly try to do clean survival runs, but try to chain where they can just because it's fun. In my mind, Ketsui is kind of a sister game to Daioujou. They were made one after another by the same people for the same hardware, they have a similar look and sound to them, and they are often considered to be the double pinnacle of Cave's Danmaku design. In some ways, I even like Ketsui a little better. The bullet patterns are more original, and I appreciate how the scoring system isn't as punishing. But a truly great shmup isn't just about gameplay, it's also about vibe. It's about the kind of atmosphere it creates and how it makes us feel. And here I'm not only talking about the emotions that arise from trying to overcome the challenges of the game. Ketsui has really good music, and there's this nice sense of journey with how all of the stages meld into each other. But there's something about the game that leaves me a bit cold. I guess it's just too military for my tastes. There's helicopters, tanks, shipyards, factories, and honestly, that's what most shmups are about. But all of this theming doesn't really touch me in any way. Now Daioujou also has this military thing, even if it's more sci-fi this time. It also starts the unfortunate trend in cave games where they combine images of violence and warfare with young female characters in questionable outfits. Now that's a big topic that could be its own whole video, so I won't go deeper into it here. I just want to say that there's stuff about Daioujou that I dislike. But there's also beauty and sadness and things that are hard to put into words that really speak to me in this game. This artwork was created for the arcade release of Black Label, and it was also used as the cover for the PlayStation 2 version. It shows the player ship riddled with bullet holes and shot down in the deserted environments. There's no action, no heroism. It's a depiction of failure. I'm sure this is not the only video game ever made that basically has game over as the key promotional art, but it's not exactly common, and it sets up a very specific kind of mood. I love how the M2 version is a continuation of this image. It's like the wreck of the ship has been lying abandoned since the original release of the game 20 years ago, forgotten by the world. I think both the old and the new artwork express the same thing. Failure is much more common than success, both in shmups and in life, and thus we must find meaning in our struggles and our failings. We don't get to learn much about the world of Daioujou. What we get is mysterious and open to interpretation. Like stage 5 begins with the background taken from the original Dodonpachi, but ends with these Akira-like tubes and containers that hint at how the true final enemy of the game is hidden away, and that maybe it's not the best idea to let it loose. Stage 3 is just this low-res image of some snowy mountains, which kinda reminds me of how id Software took a random picture of some Chinese mountains and used it as the skybox for the hellish landscapes of Doom 1. But just like with Doom, these mountains become strange when used as a background for all of this bullet hell madness. And then there's stage 1 with its beautiful cityscape lit up in gold and Dodonpachi kanji billboards on top of buildings. There's something poetic in how these backgrounds and all of the gameplay and Manabu Namiki's soundtrack are combined together. Namiki has composed so many iconic shmup soundtracks, from Ketsui to Battle Garega and Mushihime-sama, and Daioujou has some of his most striking compositions. Stage 2 has this super cool tracker bass line with a very ghostly sounding lead synth. In stage 3 you can really hear the Detroit techno influences that are all over Garegga, and this one is actually a callback to Garegga's beloved cloud stage music. Of course, there's the iconic Stage 1 theme that starts uplifting before transforming into something more introspective. An essential part of Daioujou's vibe is the titular Dodonpachi, the angry bee itself. Call me simple, but I think bees are the secret sauce of Dodonpachi. Like you have this sci-fi military thing going on, but then you also collect and fight bees. It's such a weird combination, but it works exactly because it's so out of place. It shifts the whole reality of the game in an intriguing way. And your whole way of playing will also shift if you decide to clear the game with Hibachi included. At the end of the normal first loop, you only get the stationary boss Koryu, which is already pretty intimidating in both its looks and attacks. But if you're playing the second loop or the one round mode of Black Label, you then get the flying bee, and this one isn't fooling around at all. Every one of its patterns is nasty in a different way and forces you to squeeze through some very tight spots. And finally, you have Hibachi, the angriest bee that ever was. Hibachi is both deeply intimidating and laugh out loud funny. It literally feels like a prank played at the player's expense. Like you survive the ordeal of getting to the end and then this tiny monster of a bee just wipes you out. And if you try to use your bombs, Hibachi will put up a shield. But of course, the fact that the true last boss is beatable is what makes it so frightening. According to a Japanese list that ranks shmups according to difficulty, doing a 2-all of Daioujou White Label, meaning beating both loops and Hibachi, is the #1 hardest shmup clear you can go for. Hibachi haunts the game with its presence, like an itch that cannot be scratched, an emptiness that cannot be filled. Honestly, unless you're very good at the game, Hibachi is kind of a puzzle where you need to figure out your hyper timings and invincibility frames. It's more about having enough resources and using them in the right way than trying to just dodge everything. Is this the best way to design a true last boss? Maybe not. But is the thought of facing Hibachi after 2 loops of Daioujou still anxiety-inducing? Absolutely. For a while, I didn't realize that there's a bee in the title screen of the game. It's hidden in plain view, just like Hibachi. And just like with the image of the crashed player ship, here the game doesn't entice you with promises of action and glory. You just get these huge kanji that spell out the title of the game. They are here to tell you what the game is about. Daioujou. Blissful, peaceful death. Things coming to an end. I'm sure many of you have heard the story of how Final Fantasy got its name. Supposedly, it was Square's last effort to produce a hit game that would allow the company to survive. Many of you may have also heard that actually it was more about just giving the game a cool name. Well, I would argue that Daioujou is the real Final Fantasy, a last gasp of a game, made by a struggling company that was strongly considering quitting their arcade business after Pro Gear in 2001. It feels like a summation of a bygone era when shmups ruled arcades. Even all the music tracks are named after different shmup developers, like Stage 1 being Toa as in Toaplan, and Stage 2 being Psycho as in Psycheo. There's a sense of both resignation and pride to the whole game, like it's a funeral march and a protest march at the same time. It's like having no hope but still refusing to give up against impossible odds, and miraculously surviving. So is Daioujou a perfect shmup? I would say no, but here I need to stress the word I because some of these are more like design choices instead of being clear-cut flaws. For me, they still let the game down somewhat. As I said earlier, I'm not a fan of looping in shmups. Having optional hard modes and true last bosses is awesome, but making you play through the easier first loop every time before getting to the extra spicy second round is just not good design to me, and even Cave mostly abandoned the practice. Just 2 years after Daioujou, they made Mushihime-sama, and that game has 3 different modes selectable from the start, which is super nice. Or if you really want to have a 2-loop game, entice the player by having cool twists like Zero Ranger does. I know that looping is such a big part of arcade culture that people may find my opinion misguided, but that's just how I feel. I just don't want to play the same game 2 times in a row, especially when Hibachi basically requires you to save most of your lives for the very end of the game, which means you can't make mistakes. I think most would agree that the ship selection in Daioujou is kinda wonky. Like the 2 main ship types are totally fine. Type A is fast but has a narrow shot, and Type B is slow but has a wide shot. Cool. But then there's also the 3 quote-unquote dolls you choose from. There's Shotia, who has a good rapid shot but a weak laser and gets lots of bombs. Leinyan has a weak shot but a strong laser and gets a moderate amount of bombs. Exi has both a strong shot and a strong laser but has very few bombs. This may sound good on paper, but Exi really seems like the one that the game was designed for. And then Shotia and Leinyan are just downgrades that trade firepower for bombs instead of being meaningful alternatives. You need to die a couple of times to get your full bomb slots anyway, and bombing messes up your chains, which messes up your score. What's especially lame is that if you die with Exi, you stay pretty strong and you only need to get 1 power up to get back to full power. But with Shotia and Leinyan, your weaker shot drops all the way down to level 1, and that can trip you up if you die in a bad place and can't recover quickly. I think it's really telling that most people end up playing Exi after a while. Like my first clear was with B Shotia, and it was okay for the time, but it's impossible to go back to playing her now, because her laser and the movement speed while lasering just feels so bad. Lately I've been experimenting with B Leinyan and it's actually pretty fun, except for the death spirals that can happen due to getting powered down. Again, I feel like recovery as a design choice has fallen out of favor for a reason. There's also some small things that emerge as you play more, like the hitbox size could be just a tiny bit smaller, building up the hyper meter could be slightly faster while the chain meter could be a touch more forgiving, and also the increase in rank could be less abrupt. Amazingly, all of these things were tweaked in the Black Label version of the game. You can even choose to play a 1-round game where you face Hibachi after the first loop. And for second loop players, you don't need to earn your lives back anymore and you can continue in the loop. What's really cool about these changes is that they make the game less punishing without taking anything meaningful away from the challenge. It's the same game, just less cruel. There's a couple of changes that I feel a bit random, like some of the patterns being slightly different, and honestly here I don't have a preference between the labels, but all the other stuff just feels like an improvement to me. It's interesting that as far as I can see, in Japan they seem to really prefer white label. Super players like Fufufu and SPS play white label, and Arika's excellent PS2 version is white label only. And then there's the M2 port, which I obviously haven't played yet, so I might be wrong about this, and I really hope to be wrong. But looking at M2's live streams, it seems like all the extra modes, like the arcade challenge and arranges, are based on white label. Black label is playable of course, but as a separate option in the menu. I'm guessing white label was just the dominant version in the arcades, with black label being this later special edition that wasn't so widespread. And in that kind of situation, it makes sense that the version that is more common and thus has the most players and scoring competition is the one that becomes the version of the game. Even though I prefer Black Label, I've also played a lot of White Label, simply because the PS2 version can be easily played on a CRT, which makes the game look and feel extra nice. So White Label isn't bad or anything, it's just a shame that it tends to overshadow Black Label in the official releases. Even with some rough edges, I would say that Dodonpachi Daioujou is one of the best action video games ever created. It's a shame that it's virtually unknown outside of a sub-niche of a genre that hasn't been in vogue for over 2 decades. Outside of an iOS port in 2012, I don't think it's ever been released outside of Japan, so the M2 port is kind of a big deal, but again, it's Japan only. Sure, you can buy it anywhere by ordering a physical copy or making a Japanese account on PSN or eShop, but I feel like only the people who are already invested in the genre are going to go through those hoops. As sad as it may be, I don't think the game will ever receive the more widespread acclaim that it deserves. But if you're watching this, you're probably a shmup nerd, or at least somebody who is curious about these games. Dodonpachi Daioujou is made for you. The new M2 port is for you. This is a game that deserves to be celebrated, played, and blissfully died in. By you. Thanks for watching.